A leg turns to liquid. The medical reality unfolding in the royal chambers defied everything physicians understood about the human body. Louis XIV's leg transformed from living flesh into something resembling meat left to rot in summer heat. What began as small coin-sized ulcers had spread like spilled ink across parchment, covering his entire leg from knee to ankle. The infection advanced with methodical precision, claiming new territory each day. The gangrene turned his skin black and glossy, resembling burned leather stretched too tight across swollen flesh. This was not the clean blackness of charcoal, but the mottled darkness of tissue that had died and begun to putrefy while still attached to living bone. Areas where blood flow had ceased completely took on an almost metallic sheen. The discoloration spread in irregular patches that merged and expanded, creating a map of destruction across what had once been the royal leg that danced at court ceremonies. The swelling became so grotesque that his leg doubled in size. The skin stretched beyond its natural limits, becoming thin and translucent in places where pressure from accumulated fluids and gas pushed against the surface. You could see the outline of bones beneath tissue that had become bloated and distorted. The normal contours of muscle and tendon disappeared under layers of infected fluid. When the pressure became too great, the skin simply split open along natural stress lines, creating gaping wounds that leaked continuously. These ruptures occurred without warning, suddenly releasing streams of infected discharge that soaked through bandages within minutes. The splits revealed layers of tissue underneath that had already begun to liquefy. Some openings revealed muscle that had turned gray and started to separate from bone, while others exposed tendons that had weakened to the point where they could be pulled apart with gentle pressure. Pieces of dead tissue began falling off his leg like bark peeling from a diseased tree. These chunks of flesh would separate during routine bandage changes, coming away in the hands of physicians who had no choice but to remove the putrid material. Some fragments were small, no larger than coins, while others came away in strips several inches long. The underlying tissue revealed by this process looked nothing like healthy human anatomy. Instead of pink muscle and white tendon, doctors found gray matter that had the consistency of overcooked meat. Daily bandage changes became exercises in horror that tested the resolve of even the most experienced court physicians. Each morning revealed new evidence of overnight decay, with chunks of flesh that had liquefied during sleep coming away with the old dressings. Physicians found themselves removing what had been solid tissue the previous day, now transformed into a substance that resembled spoiled pudding. The rate of decay accelerated as the infection spread. The king's physical agony reached levels that defied description as nerve endings died in some areas while remaining painfully active in others. Louis XIV experienced the unique torture of feeling his leg both burning with excruciating pain and going completely numb at the same time. He would scream from the agony in infected areas while simultaneously begging doctors to do something about regions of his leg that he could no longer feel. The absence of sensation terrified him more than the pain itself. During lucid periods, Louis XIV begged his physicians to amputate the entire leg, believing that losing the limb was preferable to watching it consume him piece by piece. His doctors refused these desperate requests, fearing that surgical amputation would kill him immediately through shock and blood loss. They failed to recognize that their current approach was achieving the same result through prolonged torture. The infection created pockets of pus that functioned like biological time bombs, building pressure until they burst without warning. These eruptions would soak through multiple layers of bandages within hours, requiring constant attention from servants who had to replace dressings several times each day. Each pocket that burst revealed new cavities in his leg where healthy tissue had been consumed and replaced with infected fluid. The gangrene poisoned his blood, sending toxins throughout his system that caused fever, delirium, and moments of clarity when he fully understood what was happening to his body. Even Louis XIV's legendary willpower, the force of personality that had dominated European politics for decades, proved completely inadequate against the biological reality of tissue death. His body had begun the process of decomposition while he remained alive to witness every stage of its progression. Once gangrene and internal toxins had advanced to this stage, 17th century medicine possessed no effective countermeasures to halt the decay. The infection creates its own environment for continued growth, spreading through blood vessels and tissue planes with mechanical inevitability that rendered human intervention essentially meaningless. What made this medical nightmare even more disturbing was that it was unfolding not in private, but before an audience of hundreds who were required by protocol to pretend that nothing extraordinary was happening. The court's deadly charade. The elaborate ceremonies continued with mechanical precision, transforming Versailles into the most surreal theater performance in European history. Every morning, French nobles dressed in their finest silk and velvet, applied perfume and powder, then proceeded to conduct state business while their monarch literally decomposed before their eyes. They discussed weather and gossip, signed trade agreements, and performed the same rituals that had defined court life for decades. The only difference was that their sovereign now resembled a living corpse more than a divine ruler. Courtiers developed an almost supernatural ability to ignore what their senses told them was happening. They would enter the royal chambers, breathe through their mouths to avoid the overwhelming smell, and engage in normal conversation while Louis XIV writhed in agony mere feet away. Diplomatic meetings continued on schedule. Marriage negotiations proceeded without interruption. The machinery of absolute monarchy had become so complex that it continued operating even when its central component was falling apart. Court protocol transformed this nightmare into a legal requirement that trapped everyone in collective delusion. Acknowledging the king's real condition could be punished as treason, so silence became mandatory under French law. No one could suggest that Louis XIV was dying or even seriously ill. Official conversations had to proceed as if nothing had changed in the kingdom. This legal framework prevented anyone from breaking character in this macabre performance, as the same rigid hierarchy that had made Louis XIV powerful now made telling the truth a criminal offense. The psychological strain on palace inhabitants reached breaking points that threatened their sanity. Servants who had worked at Versailles for decades began experiencing nightmares about the smell following them home. Nobles developed nervous twitches and digestive problems from the constant stress of maintaining composure while fighting nausea. Some courtiers started drinking heavily to dull their senses enough to function normally during required appearances. Others developed elaborate mental tricks to disconnect from what they were witnessing, treating each day like an acting performance where they played people who noticed nothing unusual. The charade nearly collapsed during an important ceremony marking a saint's feast day, when 3 different nobles fled the chapel mid-service, claiming sudden illness while clearly struggling not to vomit. The incident created whispered conversations throughout the palace about whether the performance could continue indefinitely. Palace servants began collapsing during their duties, overcome by the toxic atmosphere that had replaced the elegant environment they had once maintained with pride. Official court bulletins became exercises in creative fiction that bore no relationship to observable reality. These daily reports described Louis XIV as alert and engaged in state business while he spent hours screaming in agony and begging doctors to end his suffering. Diplomatic correspondence assured foreign governments that the French king remained in excellent health and full control of his mental faculties. These documents were distributed throughout Europe, while anyone who visited Versailles could see that the Sun King had become a figure of horror. Maintaining appearances required elaborate staging that consumed enormous resources and planning. Palace staff positioned the king's body at angles that hid the worst visible decay from visitors. They arranged lighting to cast shadows across areas where his leg had become obviously deformed. Servants learned to change his bedding and clothing in ways that minimized exposure to the infected areas, while diplomatic audiences were scheduled for times when his condition appeared most stable. Every public appearance became a carefully choreographed deception designed to preserve the illusion that nothing fundamental had changed. The courtiers' fear of punishment kept them participating in this theater of the absurd, even as their own health suffered from prolonged exposure to the toxic environment. They understood that acknowledging reality meant facing imprisonment or exile from the only world they had ever known. Their entire social identity depended on their position at court, making them willing to endure physical illness and psychological trauma rather than risk losing their status. They had become prisoners of a system that demanded they witness horror while pretending to see glory. The rigid hierarchy that had been Louis XIV's greatest source of power now worked against everyone involved by preventing rational responses to an obvious crisis. No one possessed the authority to seek outside medical help without admitting that the current situation was inadequate. No one could suggest alternative treatments without implying that the royal physicians were incompetent. No one could even recommend that the king rest or cancel appointments without acknowledging that he was too ill to perform his duties. Foreign diplomats who witnessed these scenes returned to their home countries with private reports that described Versailles as a place where rational thought had been suspended in favor of maintaining impossible fictions. Some began avoiding French court entirely, sending lower-ranking representatives who could be replaced if they became ill from exposure to the toxic environment. The palace that had once been the envy of Europe was becoming known throughout diplomatic circles as a place where sanity went to die. What makes this period particularly disturbing is the realization that hundreds of intelligent, educated people had become complicit in a performance that prioritized royal dignity over basic human compassion. They watched a man suffer in ways that would have horrified them under normal circumstances, yet they continued their charade while the king himself began to crack under pressures that no amount of absolute power could withstand. When the Sun King begged for death, by late August, the psychological collapse had begun in earnest. The most heartbreaking moment in Louis XIV's decline came when the man who had spent his entire life demanding absolute control over everything around him began pleading with God and his doctors to end his suffering. The king, who had once declared that he was the state itself, was reduced to begging for the mercy of death. During fever-soaked nights, his voice could be heard throughout the royal quarters crying out to the Virgin Mary to take his soul before dawn broke over Versailles. These desperate prayers echoed through chambers that had once hosted elegant conversations and diplomatic negotiations, now transformed into scenes from a medieval vision of hell. His mental deterioration became as disturbing as his physical decay, as pain and infection ravaged his mind along with his body. The gangrene had poisoned his blood so thoroughly that toxins affected his brain function, causing hallucinations that terrified both the king and his attendants. Louis XIV began seeing enemies lurking in shadows throughout his chambers, pointing at corners where he claimed assassins waited to strike. He accused his physicians of trying to poison him, refusing treatments and demanding that all food and medicine be tested by multiple servants before he would consume anything. The paranoia revealed how completely his legendary authority had crumbled under the assault of biological reality. The king alternated between lucid moments when he accepted his approaching death with dignity and delirious episodes where he seemed to forget entirely what was happening to him. During clear periods, he would discuss funeral arrangements and give final instructions to his advisors with the same attention to detail that had characterized his entire reign. He spoke to his 5-year-old heir about the burdens of kingship, warning against the vanity and endless wars that had consumed his own reign. But these rational intervals became shorter and less frequent as the infection spread. More often, courtiers witnessed him reliving past glories, shouting orders to long-dead generals, or conducting imaginary audiences with foreign ambassadors who had died decades earlier. Even as his body betrayed him completely, Louis XIV made heartbreaking attempts to maintain royal dignity and continue conducting state business from his bed. He insisted on reviewing documents while lying in sheets soaked with discharge from his infected leg. Foreign ambassadors were still required to present their credentials to a king whose bandages leaked continuously onto silk pillows embroidered with the royal coat of arms. He would try to sit up straight during these audiences, his face contorting with pain as he struggled to project the authority that had once come so naturally. These performances became increasingly difficult to watch, as everyone involved understood they were witnessing the final acts of a man who refused to acknowledge his own mortality. The specific moments when his iron will cracked completely provided the most disturbing glimpses into his desperation. Palace records document occasions when Louis XIV begged his attendants to cut off his infected leg entirely, promising them rewards and titles if they would end his agony through amputation. He pleaded with his physicians to give him something that would end the pain permanently, though he stopped short of explicitly asking for poison. During his worst episodes, He would grab the clothing of anyone who came near his bed, pulling them close while whispering desperate requests for help that no 17th century medicine could provide. His fear of assassination grew into full paranoia as his mind failed under the assault of constant pain and blood poisoning. The king, who had once trusted his physicians implicitly, now refused treatments, convinced that every medicine contained poison meant to hasten his death. He demanded that servants taste his food and drink before allowing anything to touch his lips. This paranoia created additional challenges for his already inadequate medical care, as treatments were delayed or refused entirely based on his delusional fears of conspiracy. The tragic irony of his situation became clear to everyone who witnessed his decline. Here was a man who had lived as an absolute monarch, controlling the lives and deaths of millions of subjects, now completely helpless and dependent on servants for the most basic human needs. Louis XIV could not feed himself, clean himself, or even change position in bed without assistance. The hands that had once signed death warrants now shook too violently to hold a pen. The voice that had commanded armies could barely whisper requests for water. Every aspect of his existence required the intervention of others, reversing the power dynamic that had defined his entire adult life. Even his closest advisors began to abandon him as the horror of his condition became unbearable to witness. Men who had served the crown for decades found excuses to avoid the royal chambers, claiming urgent business elsewhere when summoned to attend the dying king. The smell, the sounds of his agony, and the visible evidence of his decay proved too much for courtiers who had once competed for access to the royal presence. They could not reconcile the godlike figure they had feared and revered with the broken creature begging for death in silk sheets stained with bodily fluids. By the final days of August, the episodes of clarity had become brief flickers in an ocean of delirium. The infection had seized control of both his body and mind, leaving only fragments of the Sun King, who had once commanded Europe's respect and fear.